Hello everyone, welcome to the introduction lecture of English 670, Pragmatics and Language Teaching. During our first lecture today, we will do an overview of the field of pragmatics and its connections to language teaching. We will start off by introducing the concepts of pragmatics and pragmatic knowledge. And then we will talk about the importance of pragmatic knowledge in second and foreign language learning, and the consequences of lacking pragmatic knowledge. In connection to Chapter 1 in the Ishihara and Cohen's textbook, we will also be addressing the relationships between pragmatic abilities and the four language skills, including listening, reading, speaking, and writing. This introduction lecture will also include a brief introduction to the speech acts and culture, the contextual variables that are important in speech actor research, and finally, an exploratory approach to pragmatics. It is my hope that you will be using the knowledge you're gaining from this lecture and from reading the coursework and the relevant references to address the first two discussion questions of this week. So let's get started. Before we move ahead, I wanted to, for you to spend 1 minute and think about the definition of pragmatics. So what is pragmatics and what does pragmatic knowledge include? I want you to now actually pause this video for a moment and take out a piece of paper and write down your answers to these questions before resuming the video. Okay, now you have written down your answers to the two questions. Let's compare our answers. First, what is pragmatics? Pragmatics have to do with language in use. It examines meaning in context. It emphasizes on the fact that meaning is created by interaction between speakers and hearers, or between writers and readers. The next question is, what does pragmatic knowledge include? First, context is very important in the study of pragmatics, which can include various socio-cultural factors such as social roles and relationships and modes of communication, because language use varies in written and spoken modes. A large sub-area of pragmatics is the study of speech acts, such as apologies, requests, suggestions, and refusals, which are important language functions that we carry out in our life. This is a chart from a language assessment book by Bahman and Palmer. They categorize the language knowledge in different areas to correspond with a communicative model. So here we have both organizational knowledge and pragmatic knowledge. First, organizational knowledge deals with how utterances or sentence and text are organized, and it further breaks apart into grammatical knowledge and textual knowledge. Grammatical knowledge concerns knowledge of phonemes, words, or sentence structures, while textual knowledge concerns overall discourse structures. Here's one way to think about this. I want you to think about the common kinds of language tests we have done as language learners, or the tests that we give to language learners. Most of these typical language tests that we give deal with either grammatical knowledge or textual knowledge, or sometimes both. All right? And the other category we have here is pragmatic knowledge. Pragmatic knowledge is about how utterances or sentences and text are related to the communicative goals of the language user. And this is what we see here labeled as functional knowledge. There are different functions we need to use language for. For example, to express ideas, to make a request, to teach students to do creative writing, and essentially, these all boil down to the different speech act categories. Another aspect of pragmatic knowledge is sociolinguistic knowledge. Sociolinguistic knowledge is all about contexts. It has to do with how utterances, sentences, and text are related to the features of language use settings. For example, an important subcategory here is language use in different registers, such as academic prose versus conversation. We all know as language users ourselves that we use different languages in writing an academic paper from talking to a friend, and this is part of our sociolinguistic knowledge. We won't be getting too much details in any of these categories today, but my main point here through this chart is to illustrate that pragmatic knowledge is an important aspect of language knowledge. But unfortunately, pragmatic knowledge is also an area that is less frequently addressed in language teaching. And this is exactly why we're studying about it today. So why should we teach pragmatics? And why is it important for second or foreign language learners to know pragmatics? Well, I already said earlier that pragmatics is a relatively under-focused area in language teaching. But does this mean learners have less needs to learn about pragmatics? The answer is no, because language learners all have the need to learn about pragmatics. If you have studied abroad, I think you all know what I mean here by learners' needs of learning pragmatics. I wanted to remind us to remember how nervous we had all been through in trying to behave in a socially acceptable way when we first entered a new culture. As language learners and language teachers, I want us to all remember those awkward or frustrating moments we had as language learners when we're not able to communicate due to our lack of pragmatic knowledge. Pragmatic competence contains both linguistic competence and cultural competence. In a given situation, a speaker needs to know not only what to say, but also how to say it appropriately. On this slide, I provide an example I often relate to when it comes to pragmatic failures. I'm going to go into more depth later on in another lecture, but here's the example for you. In one of my previous jobs as an ESL instructor, I had an office that's located in the most crowded hallway on campus. Because the intensive English program that I worked for back then had a large number of international students, and these students were eager to learn and liked to show up in professors' offices without appointments. So we often had a number of students who were constantly banging on our closed doors during a time that's not our regular office hours and without prior appointments. To make the matter worse, when you open the door, sometimes they're not even looking for you. They could be looking for a different person. A common request from these students were, "Where is my teacher?" Imagining receiving such a request while you have already been interrupted and had no idea what's going on. Quite frustrated, right? This particular request, "Where is my teacher?" is certainly not an accepted request in this particular scenario, not only because it does not carry a conventional form of a request. So in this case, a more conventional way would be something like, "Can I talk to Professor so-and-so?" But it also violates the cultural norms in an American institutional setting, and that is, professors do not want to be interrupted without prior appointments during time outside of their office hours, especially when their doors are closed. So from this example, we see that knowing what to say and knowing how to say it appropriately are equally important in a given situation, and this requires appropriate pragmatic knowledge. When pragmatic knowledge is lacking, miscommunication can happen. Here's a joke I heard in one Chinese talk show. This is also an example I often cite to illustrate how strategies in responding to a compliment can vary greatly in different cultures. Speaker A is invited to Speaker B's wedding, and A says a compliment, "Your bride is so beautiful," and B responds, "哪里哪里." The Chinese expression 哪里 is the literal translation of the word where in English. But when this phrase is being repeated, it means something else. 哪里哪里 is a very typical modesty statement in Chinese. Lacking the knowledge of this connotation, speaker A here is confused and interprets the phrase as a weird question. So he says, where? Her eyes, her nose, her mouth, everywhere. From this example, we can see pragmatic failure happens in two aspects. Not having the linguistic knowledge, in this case, not knowing the meaning of an important phrase, and not having the cultural knowledge, and the cultural knowledge in how a speech act like complement response functions in a society. When it comes to pragmatic competence or the ability to use language in real communicative settings, there are two types according to Thomas, 1983. Pragmalinguistic competence is referring to the knowledge of linguistic choices. For example, advanced learners or speakers of English language knows different linguistic choices when it comes to requesting for information. For example, instead of asking directly, how much did you pay for that new car? We might be using the indirect approach and initiate a comment first by saying, boy, that car must have set you back a pretty penny. Sociopragmatic competence is referring to the knowledge of sociocultural norms. Still using the same example of requesting the price of someone's car, sociopragmatic competence in this case is having the knowledge of to what extent it would be acceptable to ask someone such a question. So sociopragmatic competence is not really about the linguistic choices, but about the knowledge of the context, and that is knowing whether to say something in a given social context. Many sociocultural variables need to be taken into consideration here, such as the culture, age, gender, social distance, social class, occupations, as well as the social roles and status of the addressees. Using the concept of these two types of pragmatic competence, Thomas, 1983, explains the mindset of many language teachers when it comes to error correction and pragmatics. Thomas believes that correcting pragmatic failure stemming from socio-pragmatic miscalculation is a far more delicate matter for the language teacher compared to correcting pragmalinguistic failure. Socio-pragmatic decisions are social before they are linguistic. And while foreign language learners are fairly amenable to corrections that they regard as linguistic, they are justifiably sensitive about having their social judgment called into question. So that basically put on a warning on pragmatic instruction and to remind us to pay more attention to social pragmatic problems of our learners. In the first chapter of our textbook, the authors connect pragmatic ability to the four language skills, as in this quote, pragmatic ability actually encompasses the four main channels for communication, the receptive ones, listening and reading, and the productive ones, speaking and writing. We will now be looking at the four examples of these connections, one on each language skill. The connection between pragmatic ability and listening skills is built right after birth for human beings. An infant can tell her mother's mood from her tone of voice, and she then responds in certain ways. For example, when the mother calls her lovingly, like, "Come here, baby girl, come to mommy," she will run to her excitedly. If she does something that she was not supposed to do, her mother will say, for example, "No, no, don't touch the garbage can." She will glare at her mom and stop doing it for a second. And then if she's being really naughty, she will continue with her new adventure. And then the mother will say more firmly with an angry voice, "No, no touch," with a pat on her small hand. Now the baby gets that touching the garbage can is not allowed in the house, and she will be punished if she does so. In this case, the infant already possesses the pragmatic ability to understand the different meanings through listening to the different tones, although she may not necessarily know the exact meaning of each single word in the utterance. Pragmatic ability in reading is reflected in one's ability in reading between the lines or understanding the intended meaning of the writer that may not be spelled out on the surface. The example email message you see on this slide is from the data in the empirical study I conducted last year. This email was written by an ESL participant who's a college student, addressing to his or her course instructor. The email you're seeing here is taken from the original one verbatim, while the exact spelling and punctuation of the student used was remained here. The email reads like this. Hi, Mr. Smith, how are you? Hope you have a nice day. I really email you because I have missed an important lecture, and as you know, the next 2 weeks we will start the final exam. I seen all my friends and nobody was taking notes or anything else. Would you mind to repeat the lecture again or give me a brief summary for the lecture? Because I really need it as soon as possible to study it for the exam. In my study in 2017, I asked the different college instructors to rate and comment on the communicative effectiveness of different email messages. And this email received the lowest rating score from all instructors, a total of 150 instructors. They were mostly offended by this email, particularly because of its poor demonstration of professionalism and inappropriateness indicated in its language use. Although the student writer may not realize the negative consequence of the inappropriate language used in this email, we can see how different instructors interpreted it in a quite negative way in their comments. So I've listed a few of these comments here for illustration. One person said, I was very annoyed just reading this. I would likely be a little harsher than normal with the student. This does not reflect a collegiate level of writing, thought, or respect. And another person said, student seems to be a non-English speaker, so may not understand that repeating the lecture isn't an option. The student is too informal and shows a lack of respect for the professor as he asked the professor to bear the responsibility of teaching him the notes. And another person said the student is not sincere at all. He did not write politely. The tone is too casual and pushy. Another instructor mentioned lack of proper punctuation and grammar indicates a lack of interest in really succeeding and making a strong impression. And finally, so poorly written that it suggests the student probably should not pass this course. Pragmatic ability is also reflected in the speaking skill we use every day. We need to know how to say what we want to say with the proper politeness, directness, and formality, as Ishihara and Cohen said in Chapter 1. For example, delivering bad news at work requires many careful thoughts in the planning stage. Rarely do we just directly bring out the bad news and say towards one's face, such as saying, "You are fired." For any unpleasant conversations like this, we typically prepared what we're going to say in advance and invite the person involved for a serious and private conversation. The employee who was discontinued in his or her work position is also given the opportunity to speak their mind. And the person who's delivering the bad news also tries to be encouraging and treat the employee with empathy. Lots of pragmatic concerns are involved in such a scenario to try to minimize the negative impact of the bad news. Similarly, writing requires pragmatic ability to ensure the effectiveness of the written message. The writer also needs to pay attention to the level of politeness, directness, and formality. We're going to look at an example of a rejection letter in the next slide. In this letter, we separated the content into two types. One type is highlighted with the greenish color, and these are all positive thoughts or things that are on the positive side. And the only thing that's on the negative side, which is the actual breaking out of the bad news part, is in the middle of the message. And this one is highlighted in the bluish color. As we can see, this is like a sandwich approach where you have the positive sides at the beginning and at the end, and with the negative news sandwiched in the middle. So that's a very typical pattern in terms of delivering the bad news. Starting off with appreciation token, such as saying, thank you for the opportunity to meet with you and discuss your qualification for the position of such and such job. And then also a positive comment on the applicant's background and experience. And then the mode switched to the real business, which is breaking out the bad news. And the company delivered the bad news by indicating their sincere regret, as being indicated here. And then we're going back to the positive side again by having best wishes and the future hope of the company, saying that they will return your resume in our files to review for future opening for up to 6 months. And in the event of appropriate available position, we will not hesitate to contact you. So this really gives the applicant some hope for future, and saying that they are still being considered by the company, although not being offered this particular position. And then to end the message politely with another appreciation token. So as we can see here, this is a really carefully thought out written message, which is containing a lot of pragmatic ability. And that's another example of showing the interconnection between pragmatic ability and the writing skill. Austin, in his classic work on speech acts, explains the 3 levels of meanings. First, the locutionary meaning is the most basic type of meaning. The locutionary meaning refers to the literal meaning of an utterance. For example, when someone asks you, "Do you have a watch?" A response to the literal meaning of this question is a yes, I have a watch, or no, I don't have a watch. The second type of meaning is elocutionary meaning. Elocutionary meaning is the intended meaning of utterance. For example, the intended meaning of the previous question, "Do you have a watch?" is, "Can you tell me what time it is?" The third type of meaning is the perlocutional meaning. The perlocutional meaning is the uptake of the elocutional meaning. The reflection of the perlocutional meaning is when the listener of the message responds in a way intended by the speaker, such as by answering, "It's 9 o'clock now," which is the expected answer of the question, "Can you tell me what time it is?" As Ishihara and Cohen mentioned, since speakers do not always communicate directly what they mean and listeners do not always interpret the speaker's meaning as it was intended, the speakers and the listeners need to collaborate to assure that genuine communication takes place. And this is why we say communication is a two-way street. Speech acts are closely related to people's cultural backgrounds. In a given language or language community, one is often expected to perform speech acts in a certain way. Here, I'm going to give 2 examples of speech acts. One is greetings and the other is compliment responses. In English, a typical way of greeting is by saying, "How are you?" And the expected response of "How are you?" is usually a short response, such as saying "Good, thank you," "and you," or "Okay, thank you." Sometimes will be greet the other person back, and sometimes we don't. But usually this is a quick exchange of greeting, and nobody is expecting you to go into lifelong stories about what really happens with you these days. And in Chinese, a typical way of informal greeting is by asking the other person, did you eat? Which is in Chinese, 吃了吗? And this is a very casual way of greeting, because eating is an important part of people's life in China. And the real answer doesn't really matter, what be it yes or no. And the reason for this type of greeting is just to show care. Similar notion as in English by asking how are you. And there's no intention whatsoever of the person who are initiating this greeting to invite the other person for a meal, which is a common misunderstanding. Another type of speech act that's also commonly occurring in different languages is compliment responses. Imagining this compliment, you look really nice in that dress. A typical way to respond to this compliment in English is by saying thank you. Or sometimes the person who received this compliment may have the mood of adding some other information, such as I love it too, or you look really nice too. A typical way of responding to such a compliment in Chinese is not accepting the compliment, but to deny it. So here, this would be a literal translation of the line that I give when I receive such a compliment in Chinese. I would literally say, no, I am so fat that I can barely fit in. This may sound really awkward when it's being translated into a different language, but this is exactly the same way of showing modesty, which is rooted in the Chinese culture. And for a speech act like compliment response, modesty is considered as the top priority, which is definitely reflected from the language choice and the strategy choice here. The authors of our textbook also give 2 more examples on cultural differences in the speech act of apologies. Speakers from Israel would intentionally avoid using the strategy of repair with someone who has a higher social status, because it's up to the other person to decide what to do next. And in Japan, including an explanation in apology should generally be avoided, because any excuse would appear as offensive to the addressee, especially if the addressee is of a higher social status. So these are little cultural knowledge that we need to keep in mind when we're approaching or teaching students coming from a different cultural backgrounds. There are 3 types of contextual variables that are related to speech acts. Here, we're just going to a very brief introduction. Later on, we will go into more details on how these 3 contextual variables are being operationalized in research studies and how we can consider these in our teaching context. The first one is the social status, which is abbreviated using the letter S. And this one refers to the relative status of the speaker or writer and the listener or reader. And the second one is distance, or with the abbreviation D. Distance refers to the level of social distance and psychological distance. And that is how distant or close, or how what's the extent of solidarity between the 2 people. And the third one is intensity, or abbreviated using the letter I. The intensity of the speech act are referring to, for example, the magnitude of the imposition in the request, or the severity of the infraction in apology. So for example, requesting someone for $1 million is totally different from requesting for a pencil. one is having more imposition or having greatest imposition compared to the other one. And similarly to the apology, some infraction can be more severe than others. For example, breaking somebody's very expensive car would be much more severe than bump other people over, or you know, or breaking their pencil, for example. So that's a definitely less severe situation compared to breaking a more important possession of someone. And these three contextual variables sometimes are interchanging with each other in a given context, and we definitely need to look at how they are being played together in a specific context. The exploratory approach to pragmatics is an important approach that can help us as classroom practitioners to make sense of the language use of our students in an authentic context. This approach informs learners as to why L2 speakers commonly use the language as they do, why there are differences in how meaning is conveyed in the second language, and how underlying beliefs and values with regard to culture influence L2 speakers' pragmatic behavior. This information can often be revealed via perceptual data collected via retrospective verbal protocol, RVPs, which is a particular way of collecting such perceptual data after the speakers have performed a certain speech acts. We will be discussing how to use RVPs in a future lecture on data collections. Before we end this lecture, I encourage those of you who are interested to check out two relevant resources that I mentioned in this lecture. The first one is Austin's classic work on speech acts. A simple Google search of the title, How to Do Things with Words, can bring you perhaps to the full access to the original book published in 1962. And this one is a foundational reading in the field of pragmatics. The second article is a report of my study last year, in which I talked about the concept of communication is a two-way street by investigating instructors' perceptions of student apologies. A copy of this article is included in the doc share in eCollege. And I also noticed that I forgot to include the reference of Thomas 1983, where the two types of pragmatic failure has been referred to. And you can actually find the reference entry of this one at the end of our textbook in the references section. And the title of the Thomas article is Cross-Cultural Pragmatic Failure, and that one is published in the journal Applied Linguistics in 1983. And that's all. Please make sure you also read Chapter 1 of the textbook from the Ishihara and the Cohen's book before addressing the first two discussion questions of this week. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.